The major purpose of our economic policy since we came into office a year ago has been to stop the inflation which had been going on for 5 years without doing it so quickly that it brought on a recession. Now, as a result, we are now in a position, the critical position, in which the decisions made in the next month or two will determine whether we win this battle.
To prevent inflation without recession, in a phrase, President Nixon's described what's likely to become the chief domestic issue in American politics in the coming year. Can the heat be taken out of the world's mightiest economy without plunging it into the worst depression for over a decade? At the beginning of this month, President Nixon presented Congress with a $200 billion budget, the biggest in American history. Despite its size, the budget is deflationary. Its aim is to curb rising prices without cutting back too drastically the general level of business. By getting the economy to mark time for a year, President Nixon hopes to prepare the way for more prosperity. But economists have never been more divided on the nation's prospects. We asked one expert, Paul Samuelson, what he thought would happen in 1970.
Well, I think the year 1970 is definitely going to be a year of retardation. And it's an even money bet as to whether that slowdown, that pause, will accumulate into something a little bit deeper, namely into a genuine recession.
Economists differ about what policy should be applied, but at least they all agree that inflation does exist and that it must be stopped. At the consumer level, America may not look much like an economy in distress. But in shops and supermarkets in the residential suburbs, inflation is now beginning to bite hard. In 1967, retail prices rose by 3%. In 1968, they went up 5%. Last year, the increase was over 7%, and figures for last month show the upward trend is still continuing. Over the last 3 years, most Americans were protected from the worst effects of inflation because their incomes were rising too. But with 4 years' momentum behind it, inflation's built severe distortions into the economy. To prevent these getting any worse, President Nixon and his advisors followed a deflationary policy for most of last year, and its effects on the commercial and industrial life of the nation are now clearly visible. On Wall Street, share prices fell steadily throughout 1969 until at the beginning of this month the market stood at its lowest level for 6 years. Company profits have been slashed and shareholders throughout the nation have had to accept reduced dividends. Hardly surprisingly, Wall Street's brokers go about their business in a state of almost permanent gloom. On the industrial front, it's the car manufacturers who've been hardest hit by the restrictions. Detroit executives have no time for euphemisms like slowdown or decline. They say they're well and truly in a recession and have thousands of unsold vehicles to prove it. This stockpile of 1970 Chryslers has been growing since before Christmas. Both production and sales are at their lowest levels for nearly 10 years. General Motors alone has closed 6 of its 23 assembly plants, and layoffs affecting 150,000 car workers have been announced this month. All the indications are that the decline in the car industry is accelerating. Shortage of credit has hit the building trades too. Last year, the nation achieved only half its housing target. Mortgage loans are up to 8.5%, but even at that rate, money is hard to come by, so buildings stopped on many estates. The federal mint, producing many thousands of dollars a day, is at the heart of the economic controversy. Inflation means having more money in circulation than the country has really earned. But although you can't increase national wealth simply by printing more money, there is a relation between money supply and economic activity. America's money supply normally grows at the rate of 4% a year, but the Federal Reserve Bank, which controls such policy, has kept the growth to zero over the last 6 months. Some economists say that by doing so, by refusing to print more money, the bank is merely helping to create a recession. Everyone agrees that monetary restraint is an important weapon in the fight against inflation. But some economists believe it's already been taken too far. Professor Samuelson is not one of them.
I'm an optimist compared to many of my economist colleagues, because there's quite a school of economists, particularly those who are monetarists, who just think that the Federal Reserve determines everything. I don't belong to their ranks, who think that 1970 is sure to be a year of recession, and a year of pretty deep recession, because the Federal Reserve Board in Washington has been clamping down so very tight on the money supply. And they say you can't do that without causing trouble, spelled with a capital T, big trouble.
I, Arthur F. Burns, do solemnly swear
I, Arthur F. Burns, do solemnly swear
that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States
that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States
against all enemies, foreign or domestic.
The man who's now got the job of controlling the nation's money supply is Dr. Arthur Burns, the new chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. He takes over at a time when the business community is looking forward to a relaxation of financial restrictions. He's a personal friend of President Nixon, who went to great lengths at Burns' inauguration to show his support.
You see, Dr. Burns, that's a standing vote of appreciation in advance for lower interest rates and more money. Ladies and gentlemen, as all of you know, the Federal Reserve is independent, certainly independent of the President, although the Congress would suggest that it is not independent of the Congress. I respect that independence. On the other hand, I do have the opportunity as President to convey my views to the Chairman of the Federal Reserve in meetings of the Quadriad, along with the Secretary of the Treasury and the Chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. I have some very strong views on some of these economic matters, and I can assure you that I will convey them privately and strongly to Dr. Burns in the meetings of the Quadriad. I respect his independence. However, I hope that independently he will conclude that my views are the ones that should be followed. We are confronted with the problem of inflation, and the Federal Reserve Board plays a very great role in determining whether that inflation will be checked and how it will be checked. And I think perhaps it could be said that it requires a very wise man to be chairman of the Federal Reserve or to be a member of the board with all of that responsibility. I think Arthur Burns would put it this way, that it is a great hardship on some people to do those things that control inflation. But it is a greater hardship on all people to allow inflation to go on. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting by that the Federal Reserve Board should stop inflation at the cost of recession. That's where the wisdom comes in.
But the wisdom of President Nixon's policies is a matter for debate. We asked Professor Samuelson if he thought the administration was doing enough to prevent inflation getting even worse.
I don't think so, but it's very easy for me to criticize, and they did inherit some genuine problems from the 1960s. The whole decade of the 1960s after 1961, when President Kennedy came into office, was a long, long period of expansion. It was a period of healthy expansion until the Vietnam War sneaked up on the American people, and after 1965 the healthy expansion continued, but it turned into a frenetic, unhealthy, wartime inflation. And that inflation problem has proved to be a little more difficult for President Nixon than candidate Nixon, when he was running for office, thought it would be. It's a tough problem. One of the things that President Nixon has thrown away, he has refused to use his leadership in his high office in counseling with business and with unions. Sometimes that's called jawbone persuasion, as if it's empty talk. There's plenty of experience here and abroad showing that when you have a popular president, when you have a president with real leadership who says to industry, you can do things two ways. you can accentuate the inflation, you can make every decision on the upside, or you can sell a lot of goods, take a more moderate margin on each, and you'll be better off in the long run. That was very effectively used by President Kennedy, with some effect by President Johnson. It's no substitute for Federal Reserve policy. It's no substitute for a balanced budget. But President Nixon, for what I would say are ideological reasons, has refused to use that kind of leadership. The result is he may find himself with a longer inflation, and he may find himself very reluctantly doing things like wage and price control, which he, of all people, ideologically abhors and wouldn't want.
The implications of a recession in the American economy are not confined to the United States alone. Here on Wall Street, people still remember the great crash of 1929 and the worldwide depression that followed it. We asked Professor Samuelson if there was any danger of a similar disaster in the conditions of today, when the United States is still the cornerstone of the world's economy and when an even larger proportion of world trade is financed by the dollar. Could history repeat itself?
Well, we happen to be 6% of the people in the world, but we're about 40% of the economic weight, the gross national product. But I don't think it's any longer a case that the United States, as during the 1930s and the Great Depression before Franklin Roosevelt took over, is the sick old man of Europe. It used to be said that when we sneeze, Europe gets pneumonia. Well, I don't think that the problem is that serious. On the other hand, we're a very good customer. We are importing a lot, too much, in terms of our balance of payments. And if we had a serious recession, if we went back to Herbert Hoover's days, then the rest of the world would feel that in their business. Now, I don't think that you can resurrect Herbert Hoover's days. We're in a new, mixed economy. We no longer are the capitalism of Calvin Coolidge and Queen Victoria. This is a managed macroeconomic economy, not managed by comprehensive planning, but managed by fiscal policy, managed by Federal Reserve monetary policy.
Professor Samuelson, from the point of view of the human being and human behavior, do you think that there is a human dimension to this overall economic situation that we are confronted with?
Yes, always. I think that there are two problems that are foremost in the mind of the American in every walk of life. First is the Vietnam War. It's an unpopular war, but we don't know how to get out of it. I am hopeful that we are in the process of getting out of that war. And let me stress this, and I'm speaking now as an economist. I'm not speaking as a moralist or as a philosopher. I happen to disapprove of the war, but I forget that. Economically, the best thing that could happen in the United States would be to get out of that war. That war is intensifying every economic problem. It's making our balance of payments worse, it's making the inflation worse, and so forth. So it's not true that grass will grow in the streets if we don't have this Cold War expenditure. On the contrary, we can begin to do some of the things that the American people want done. So the first thing is the war. But the second thing that's on his mind, the man in the street, and particularly his wife and his girlfriend, is the inflation. Everybody feels very poor. They haven't been getting the normal increase in their living standards that every red-blooded American expects to get. They feel cheated by inflation. And that's why President Nixon had better begin to make some progress on this. He doesn't want to hear from the people.